Thank you so much. Good morning. Welcome. Thought we'd start you off with a light topic today, the crisis in Syria. We were very lucky last night to hear about this directly from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And what we're going to do here today is analyze our current policy in Syria. What are the gaps between our rhetorical policy and our functional policy? What are our interests there? What are our allied interests there? And then what should we do about it? But before we start, I'd like to quote John McCain, who said, "Everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but no one is entitled to their own facts." And yes, I'm aware he stole that from Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And I would like to lay out some facts to frame this discussion. The war in Syria, entering its 9th year, is one of the greatest humanitarian tragedies of the modern era. 500,000 innocent civilians killed, at least, 12 million displaced, 5 million refugees, some of the worst mass atrocities systematically perpetrated since the Holocaust. The torture and murder of tens of thousands of civilians in custody, starvation sieges, chemical weapons, you name it. Fact, the Syrian crisis started as a peaceful protest where innocent people called for dignity, self-determination, and other basic universal rights. It turned violent when a totalitarian dictatorship opened fire on its own people in response to those protests. And the current conflict is now a battleground for at least 6, if not more, major world powers who have subjugated the interests of the Syrian people to their own strategic and military designs and economic designs. In fact, the U.S. strategy, as we've understood it for the last 7 years, has failed, at least as it's been explained to us, to support the Syrian opposition, to have a seat at the table for a negotiated solution that would give them these basic rights. In fact, the United States as a country is war-weary, and the American people are weary of military interventions. And they've elected presidents, including President Obama and President Trump, who share that war weariness. And that is an important factor in how our policy is made. Throughout the crisis, JINSA has been one of the organizations that's devoted resources and time and energy to convening experts, especially military, but not only military experts, to bring a clear-eyed analytical approach to this problem based on data and real research and the intention to speak truth to power. In last year's JINSA's Iran report, based on a task force set up, co-chaired by Ambassador Edelman, they said, quote, "Most urgently, the United States must impose real obstacles to Tehran's pursuit of total victory by the Assad regime in Syria. Time is of the essence." Last month, in their 2018 report, the quote was, "The United States needs a forceful and clear policy to roll back the growth of the Iranian threat." Let me start there and go to Ambassador Edelman. Have we made any progress, really, since 2017? You issued that report. When you look at the policies laid out by Secretary Pompeo last night to our group, does it match, does the rhetoric match the functional policy, and does it have a chance of achieving its goal?
Well, Josh, first, it's great to be here again at JINSA and with this group, and certainly with General Amador and my old partner in crime and government, John Hanna. And so I'm glad to be able to be here today. I'm sorry to have to be here to discuss this topic because over the last, 4 or 5 years, I've appeared at any number of panels on precisely this subject, and it does have, unfortunately, a sense of the movie Groundhog Day, which is every day you get up and it's the same, the same thing. So first, let me just before I kind of answer your question, let me make an observation, which is nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the international system. And when you talk about a conflict that's involving now 6 major powers, part of the reason for that is that the United States over an 8-year period has basically abdicated its leadership role almost totally. And what happens when that happens is that other forces, not usually benign, enter into the vacuum that's been created and begin to operate, on their own and on behalf of their own, frequently very narrow interests and without the kinds of restraints that normally accompany U.S. involvement in a conflict. And so a lot of what you're seeing, is a result of that phenomenon. And I think that has got to be the beginning of any discussion of this. In the Obama administration, people said, "Oh, U.S. intervention, that's a terrible thing to contemplate for some of the reasons you discussed, war weariness, et cetera. And if the United States were to get involved in any serious way, either in aiding the opposition or more directly, it'll only increase the violence, increase the suffering, prolong the conflict, and there's no military solution to the conflict anyway." Well, what we've seen is that inaction by the United States has led to the very things that this policy was meant to avoid, which is increased violence, a longer conflict, more suffering for the Syrian people, as you outlined, a catastrophic refugee crisis, which you didn't mention, that is bringing enormous damage to the institutions of Europe and stressing and straining a number of our allies in the region with enormous refugee presence. So if you look at Jordan, you look at Turkey, both are bearing about 3 million refugees on their territory, which is a huge burden. I know we'll be talking about Turkey in the next panel, so I'll reserve my comments on that aspect of it for later. But U.S. inaction led to the very things that it was supposed to prevent. So that I think would be my first point. The second point is we were told that there was no military solution to this problem. But what we've seen, particularly since September 2015, when the Russians interceded in conjunction with Iran and Iran's proxies, Hezbollah, Iraqi Shia militias, Afghan Shia militias, Quds Force, et cetera, that there is a military solution if you have the will to use military power and impose it on people, and if you're completely unrestrained by any kind of moral scruples. I mean, you pointed out the use of chemical weapons, targeting of civilians, et cetera. The U.S. got involved in this, finally, under enormous pressure in summer of 2014 with a very narrow mission established by the Obama administration, which was to defeat the Islamic State and the physical caliphate it had created in both Iraq and Syria. For quite a long time, I would say, and we discussed it in panels here in previous years, the U.S. lacked a kind of serious military strategy. I would give a lot of credit to former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, who, when he came into office, finally pulled together a kind of strategy for the military campaign. I would give some credit to the Trump administration for what came into office, taking that strategy and relieving some of the impediments that had made it harder for the commanders to actually execute it in the field. And that strategy has largely been successful in rolling back the physical caliphate, both in Iraq and in Syria, largely through the agency of our own proxy ally in the region, which has been Kurdish forces and the Iraqi security forces in Iraq. So
On Iran.
right, but the Iran part is what remains to be done, and this administration, I believe, has got two distinct groups within it who have two different views. The president's view is a little bit ambiguous, although I think he sides intellectually, at least, or emotionally, with those who see this as just another endless war that the U.S. has gotten itself into in the region, and the best thing we can do is get out as soon as possible. We've taken care of ISIS, so let's just get out. I think there are others who recognize that, A, doing that would be a prescription for a return of ISIS, in a new form, 2.0, but also the presence of the very small number of U.S. Special Forces partnered with some effective Kurdish fighters provides the U.S. with some leverage, in part because the territory they control happens to be fairly valuable to the regime. And if the U.S. now, since there's going to be some kind of political solution at some point to this, wants to play a role in that, it cannot continue to abdicate its leadership role. It has to have some counters on the table, and a continuing presence in Syria at relatively low levels and low cost, I think, is tolerable to the American people, and a necessity if we want to try and do what the administration says it wants to do in terms of its overall Iran policy, which is to roll back Iranian influence in the region. To do that, Syria, in my view, is the key. I mean, there are other places as well, Bahrain, Yemen, Lebanon, et cetera, but Syria is the key. If we give up on Syria and let Iran maintain a presence there, I think it'll be a problem for some of our friends in the region, but it'll be a long-term problem for us as well. Not the least of the reasons being the Iranian presence, predictably, will lead to increased radicalization of the Sunni population in Syria and more problems with extremist Islam of the sort we've had in the past.
Thank you. So if I'm hearing you correctly, we have an imperative to deal with Iran and Syria, but not an actual strategy to get us there that anyone can explain.
I think there are elements of a strategy. There are people in the administration who have a strategic view of this. I think the administration has not made clear what its policy ultimately is going to be.
Thank you, thank you. Let me skip over and go to John now. One thing I thought, and we'll come back to you, General, after this, one I thought was fascinating from Secretary Pompeo last night was he said, we now have, quote unquote, 2 more objectives in Syria than we used to have. We had the objective of defeating ISIS, and the Secretary of State said last night, now we have 2 more, a political solution and forcing the Iranians out. So we just talked about forcing Iranians out. Let's talk about the political solution. We have a new special envoy, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, well known to many people in this room. I don't think anyone would say he's not one of the best, if not the best qualified people to take on that job. But again, there seems to be a gap between our rhetorical policy and our functional policy. I'm wondering, what do you see? Is there really something new in our diplomatic strategy that could give us this long-sought leverage to bring Assad to the table, to negotiate a solution that guarantees the rights of the Syrian people? Or are we repeating in a Groundhog Day way our promises to support a political solution without the resources and commitment to back it up?
First of all, let me thank everybody at JINSA and thank Mike and the Gamunder Center and for all the incredible and outstanding work they've been doing. And it's a real honor to be part of it, and honored to again be part of one of these sessions. You can't help but answer that question and be extremely pessimistic, given where we've been over the last 7 years, given where we've been since 2015. I think Eric is right that basically the big question about the end state of this conflict is Assad going to stay or is he going to go? Assad is staying. The Russians, Iranians, and Assad have won that question, and now we're fighting around the perimeter of this for issues like what happens to the Kurds? Are they able to maintain some kind of a political and economic autonomy and rights up in their corner of northeast Syria? And what happens to the big question that's fundamental to American strategic interests of the competition with Iran for primacy in the northern tier of the Middle East? But the question of Assad staying or going, I think, is done, and I don't think anything that can happen. I think Geneva is, in fact, basically premised on the fact that for some period of time, he's going to be there, and I do think, in terms of thinking about progress that's been made in the strategy, I do think the Jeffrey appointment is an important important move by the United States to appoint somebody of Jim's caliber and it looks like to empower him to try and forge this diplomatic strategy, but most importantly, to give him some minimal degree of leverage that has been largely lacking in U.S. policy to be any kind of player at the political table. I think that over the last couple of months, without a lot of fanfare, it looks like they've settled the question of the American presence in Syria is going to remain as a major tool in our bag to try and press the Russians into thinking about a political settlement that at least begins to address or take into account American and Israeli interests, particularly with respect to the Iranian question. And it's wielding this decision to maintain the permanent presence, to withhold any kind of Western or international reconstruction assistance, leaving that bill to the Russians and Iranians, unless they're able to begin to address some of our interests there, together with, I think, the fact that I think there's now a conscious decision that we are going to subcontract the military component of this to our Israeli partners, essentially, with respect to the Iranian question. That now is much more, I think, visible and transparent than it was before, that the United States, with some exceptions, particularly regarding the red line on chemical weapons, is not going to become a major military player in here, but we are now fully backing Israeli military moves against the Iranians in Syria. And as JINSA has proposed, I think we could see some further empowerment of that option and that significant piece of leverage. And it's all, the target here all has to be really the Russians, I think. And there remains this question, can the Russians, if they wanted to and had enough incentive and had enough pressure on them, actually move Assad to begin taking actions against the Iranians? And would the Iranians obey? What would the Russians do if the Iranians said, no way, we don't care what you want, we're not getting out? But I think that's the target. I think there's still plenty of people, including in Israel, who believe the Russians can somehow be a player and a partner here in at least circumscribing Iranian influence and pressing Assad toward a political accommodation that's less worse from our standpoint than just totally awful. It'll still be bad, but it may not be totally awful. So I do think that we've actually seen some more hopeful signs. I thought the incident in Idlib, there's probably lots of reasons, but the Russians and Assad didn't go in the beginning of September into Idlib when everybody virtually thought it was a foregone conclusion that they were going to perpetrate another mass slaughter in Idlib that would have had dramatic ramifications in terms of sending, several million people potentially up toward Turkey and Europe again in a major refugee crisis and humanitarian catastrophe. And for whatever reasons, maybe partially the appointment of Jeffrey as a kind of mobilizing tool, but the President of the United States happened on a tweet that said, don't go into Idlib. That was reinforced subsequently by Jeffrey and by other senior administration officials, and introducing a degree of certainty. This may not just be about chemical weapons. If you guys go into Idlib, we could see that as threatening all unto itself. And again, we had a Turkish presence on the ground. The Russians had to consider that. Turkish ground troops in and around Idlib that they may have had to take on and got into a big fight with the Turks. But I do think the injection of that American variable, even this late in the day, into Putin's thinking, I think did introduce a degree of question mark and again underscored that while it is very late and the Americans have lost a lot of tools and leverage that we might have otherwise used in 2012 and 13 and 14, when the United States speaks and says that it might do something, particularly militarily, the rest of the world listens, including the Russians. So I think it's a worthwhile data point that we ought to keep in mind.
Excellent. And you touched on a couple of things there. The Israeli-Russian dynamic, which I'm going to ask you about in a moment. The use of reconstruction money withholdings as leverage. Is that really going to work? We can talk about that. But to your last point, why did the president tweet that Iran shouldn't invade Idlib? Well, we actually know because the President of the United States told us in a press conference at the United Nations. It's worth taking a moment, and I happen to have it here. He was at a fundraiser where a Syrian woman stood up and said that there's 3 million people in Idlib that are about to be killed by the Iranians, Russians, and the Syrians. And the president said to her, quote, this is according to the president, "That's not going to happen. I never heard of Idlib province." And then he came back to New York, and he opened up the failing New York Times. This is what he said in the press conference. And he said, quote, "Well, that's the same story that the woman told me that I found hard to believe. Because why would anyone do that with 3 million people?" So then he decided to put out the tweet and told John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and everybody, quote, "Don't let it happen." I said, "Don't let it happen." And then it stopped. No one's going to give me credit, but that's okay. Then he says, "And millions of people have been saved. And I gave great credit to Iran, to Russia, and to Syria for not doing it. And I think millions of people would have been killed, and that would have been a shame," close quote.
Josh, I'm sorry, I have to intercede here, even though I swore that I was going to make sure that Devin got to do all the turkey business. But John made the point, but the president deserves some credit here. But actually, I think the main credit goes to Tayyip Erdogan, who I don't normally give much credit to, because he actually was negotiating with Putin for precisely the same outcome, which was to prevent an attack on Idlib. He signed up to a deal that I doubt very much he's going to be able to deliver on, but I think it was at least that, it was that deal that was at least as important, if not more important, than the president's tweet, although the tweet, as John said, did give a signal that other people had to consider, and that's important.
Sure.
And I think John's right. It does show how we still can have some influence. It also, by the way, I think underscores why John and I might have a slight difference here, which is that John was saying he thinks that the appointment of Jim Jeffries shows we've now kind of turned a corner and changed our policy in some direction, and I would agree with that for now. Because in this administration, any policy can be undone on a moment's notice by a tweet.
Great points, thank you. And I think as we listen to the president talk, we understand that if he can change his mind on a dime, he can change it again on a dime. And that introduces an unpredictability that undermines our strategic policy. General, it's been...
I'm not going to speak about the United States president.
Understood, understood. Let's talk about the Israeli prime minister and the Russian president. The Israeli prime minister and the Russian president have had, I would say many times more meetings, I don't know the exact number, than the Israeli prime minister has had with the US president. Unprecedented. Trips to Moscow, deals, and as was reported in the Washington Post by me, they struck a deal in southern Syria that would essentially ensure the Iranians would stay so far, 80 kilometers, whatever, away from the Israeli and Jordanian borders. The Russians and the Syrian Assad regime would be allowed to police that area, and the border would be handed back to them based on the 1974 armistice. Is that the new diplomacy in the Middle East? Is it Russia-led? Will all of our allies now go to Moscow before they go to Washington? And do you think the Israeli government really believes that Putin can be a guarantor of security in the Middle East?
It's not, first of all, thank you for inviting me here, and I'm very proud to be part of Gemander's Center of JINSA, and yesterday was amazing as an Israeli general to see the connection between the American fighters and the American civilians. Very impressive. To the question, you have to remember, we didn't invite the Russians to build a base 150 miles north of Israel. if someone made a mistake, that was agreed between the Prime Minister and Putin, the answer is no. We didn't invite the Russians to be a very important factor on the air and in the ground in Syria. This is, for us, it's like a weather. It's a fact that we have to deal with. And we found ourselves that although we know the balance between Israel and Russia is not so good, that we have to deal with it. The Americans are not there to do the job of dealing with the Russians. So Israel has to do the job of dealing with the Russians. And we had one very clear idea in our mind when we begin this dialogue. We have to keep the freedom of action of Israel in spite of the Russian being there. I'm saying being there because I don't want to elaborate. It's not just the Air Force, it's not just the intelligence, it's much more than that. And we didn't find any allies to help us to gain this freedom of maneuvering. So we had to do it the best way that we could be done. One of this element was the relations between the Prime Minister and the President, and I hope that will be kept in the future, with all due respect to all those who are asking themselves what Israelis are doing with the Russians. What we are doing, we try to keep our ability to contain the Iranians in Syria, period. Not more than that, but not less than that. And it's very complicated when you don't have the Americans nearby. And the Americans are practically in Tanef and around Tanef, helping the Kurds in the north. But when it is coming to containing the Iranians, the Americans are practically not there. And we have to take the burden by ourselves. We know it. It's very important that Americans will stay there because this is the only barrier between an open corridor between Iran, Iraq, and the Mediterranean. But for containing the Iranians building up in Syria, the Americans are not there to help. I don't urge the Americans to be. It's your business. It's your decision. But facts on the ground should be very clear. The burden of containing the Iranians in from building their independent war machine in Syria is on us.
I understand.
And for that, we need a dialogue with the Russians.
That makes sense. So the follow-up question would be, in exchange for that, what the Russians have asked and what Israel seems to be providing is a step towards normalization with the Assad regime in a post-civil war Syria where Assad and Russia and Iran have won the war. And if Israel is okay with handing over control of the border and the southern area to the Assad regime and Russia, well, you can see that as a departure from years of Israeli policy and a sign that other countries in the region may take steps towards normalizing with the Assad regime. I'm thinking about Jordan, which is making lots of steps to normalize with the Assad regime. Is that what's going on in your region? Are America's allies now making plans with the assumption that the Assad regime will be a semi-normal member of the international community and then looking out for not only its security but its economic interests, which seems to me to undermine the actual U.S. policy that we've just been talking about, namely to put pressure on the Assad regime?
Unlike others, we never said that we have an interest that Assad will not be the next ruler of Syria. We said from the beginning, we don't interfere in the war between Assad and the rebels. There is a theoretical question if the Saudis and the Emirates would have the ability to build a strong rebel system against Assad, maybe the decision would be different. But from the minute that we understood that there is any organized rebels organization, it's many very little organization. I asked our experts once to give me the number of organizations, rebel organizations in Idlib, and the number was 42 organizations just around Idlib. So we understood from the beginning that there is no choice, real choice here. You don't say, okay, I'm going with the rebels, and you don't know who are the rebels, whom they represent, whom they will be afterwards. At the end, here everything is speaking about the atrocities of the regime and so on and so forth. Believe me, if the other side would have win the war, that was the end of the Alawite sect on ground. Some pretty women should be kept, but all the others would be butchered by the other side. It's not good people on one side and bad people on the other side. No, it's bad people on both sides. And at the end of the day, if Israel have to choose between Assad and ISIS, I don't know what is the best for us. We were very clear. We have one interest. We don't want to see Iranian independent war machine built in Syria. That's all, very minimal. We don't speak about who will rule Syria, who will rule Lebanon. It's not the story. We have two very clear targets: to prevent the Iranians and the Syrians from moving game change facilities, capabilities, weapon system to the hands of Hezbollah, and not let the Iranians to build independent Iranian war machine in Syria. That's all. We don't interfere in the war between the Assad regime, the Alawites, the Druze, and the Christians, and the majority Sunnis. We understand both sides. We know each side, both sides for many years. We don't trust both sides, and we're not ready to take part in this war. But we determine that success of the Assad regime will not lead to another base of the Iranians in Syria. Now the situation is more complicated because the Russians change their policy by sending the S-300 to the Syrians, and for that there are two different areas of concerns. One is the technological issue of dealing with the 300. Believe me, we have enough smart people. With some help from friends, we will find solution how to deal with the S-300. But the political question is, what now the Russians have in mind? How many Russians will be involved in the implementation or the using of the S-300? Will it be manned by Russians, Syrians, or Iranians, or whoever? So the details are very important, but the challenge here is not the technological issue. That will be okay. The problem is what political thoughts behind the decision of the non-logic decision of the Russians. This is why we are continue to have a dialogue with the Russians, and for sure the Prime Minister will meet very soon President Putin to understand what the Russians have in mind. And for us, it's very important. Of course, if America will change its policy and will be more active in Syria, we will be more than happy. But we know that we have to think in terms of taking the burden upon ourselves, because we don't know what will be the solution in Washington. Senior officials are coming from Israel to understand and to try to influence the American policy. But at the end of the day, the decision will be taken here in Pennsylvania Street, and it's not street, it's Avenue.
We get your point.
Yes,
Thank you.
Avenue. No, to call an avenue a street, we don't want to insult anyone. Pennsylvania. But at the end, we understand that it probably will be on our shoulder, and this is why, as a little state, we are not America. We have to focus on what is imperative for us.
We got it.
Iran and Hezbollah. These are the two issues that we deal with.
We got it. Thank you. Excellent. We want to go to questions. Before we do that, a couple quick follow-ups for our other panelists. If we could keep these answers a little bit shorter to give a chance for everyone else to get involved. Since you brought it up, Turkey. So I think you're absolutely right. It's both American signaling and Turkish sort of resistance to pulling out of Idlib that has forestalled the massacre for the moment. Seems like that's unsustainable. Explain to us what's Erdogan's position here. How vulnerable is his Syria stance? What does he want from us to make sure that he doesn't pull out? And if he pulls out, then what happens?
Well, yeah, well, I mean, we can go into it.
Sorry, next panel.
We'll go
Not
into
sorry.
it. I'll do this. Well, we can go into it in more depth when Devin takes your chair,
Sure.
Josh. But the brief answer is that Erdogan's position is very vulnerable because his policy in Syria has never been very popular inside Turkey. The Turkish military in the even before the coup attempt in July 2016, had been severely weakened by the long period of political persecution of the military inside Turkey. That damage to the military as an institution was increased exponentially by the aftermath of the coup. So he has a kind of uncertain instrument, and he knows it, operating in Idlib. He's taken on a task. I mean, it's really a matter of desperation. He doesn't want all these people flowing towards Turkey. As I said, they're already hosting 3 million refugees. Another 500,000 is, a huge burden on Turkey. So he took on a task in agreement with Putin that he would clear out the bad guys from Idlib so that the Russians and the Iranians don't have to. I don't believe there's any way he can cash that check.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent, thank you. And John, before we go to questions, you were talking about this idea of reconstruction money, refugees returning. We constantly hear that Russia and Assad and the Iranians want all the refugees to return and want to reconstruct the destroyed Sunni parts of Syria. Is that true? Isn't it just as likely that they actually don't want all of these refugees to return, that actually the Russians would prefer to keep Europe destabilized, Assad would prefer to keep Syria, mostly with his supporters, the people who didn't leave, that refugees face horrible persecution, and that the Iranians would rather have a destroyed Sunni Syria than a prosperous one?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, I think all of that is true. They clearly don't care about their people. But I think the Russians, it's an open question. And I guess if passed as prologue, you'd say, the Russians as a political partner in trying to forge some kind of minimal level of stability and an end to the most violent parts of the conflict, that's a losing proposition. It's not going to happen. The Russians are going to play that game, and we've been fooled numerous times in the past when we've gone to them for that. But I do think that that both the Russians and Iranians in the larger picture they face real big strategic difficulties for themselves internally, and populations who do question and are even upset by the fact that they see potentially hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars of national treasure being spent for purposes abroad that are, less than honorable. So I think they do have to worry about those things. I think the Russians don't want an endless open wound inside of Syria and escalating sectarian conflict. I think they are looking to somehow staunch this wound a little bit, that's at least a prospect. And it's clear the Russians have, with regard to this refugee question, the discussions over the last several months, they've clearly raised issues about the international community coming back in and stepping in and starting to foot some of the bill for the reconstruction of Syria. So I don't rule it out that it's entirely in play, but I appreciate the skepticism for it. But I do think it's a card that whether or not you think it can work, it's an open enough question that I think America ought to play that as hard as as hard as it can, and particularly in the bigger context of the Iranian file and the kinds of pressures the Iranians are facing internally and now, and we're going to see these major sanctions come into effect next month on oil and the central bank and perhaps on their ability to interact through the SWIFT messaging system. So this pressure on the Iranians internally and in terms of their imperial adventures across the Middle East and the money they spent on that, I think only becomes a more trenchant question for them rather than less.
Excellent, excellent.
If I may, 3 remarks about that.
Of course.
First, I think that the Russians need to consolidate their achievements in Syria, and for that they need a little bit of quietness. They don't want it to escalate, at least. The Iranians have another issue here, is the number of Shiites versus Sunnis in Syria. And at the end of the day, I think that the Iranians will be more than happy if most of the refugees will not come back. And about the construction, it's the first time that I heard the Chinese saying that they are ready to take part in the construction of Syria, and unlike the Iranians and the Russians, they have the money to do it. So here you might find another element which will make the situation in Syria even more complicated, is the appearance of the Chinese, not in the military side, but in the construction side. But you know the system, and you begin there, and you don't know how you ended up when the other side does not have the money to pay the debts.
Excellent, and I think we could do a whole panel on the Chinese. They actually have offered military troops to fight extremists, and from what I can tell, is the first time they've ever done that. But anyway, let's open it up to questions. Thank you for those added remarks. We'll save the applause for afterwards. Could I ask you each to tell us your name, your affiliation if you have one, and please put your comments in the form of a question. And we have limited time, so let's go right here, sir. Wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Maury Amate, affiliations, too many to mention. House, Senate staffer, executive director of AIPAC, vice chair of JINSA for many years. I haven't heard any discussion really about what's happening in Iraq and all sorts of things.
It was about Syria, not about Iraq.
Pardon?
It's a Syria panel, not about Iraq, but we're happy to field that question.
Yeah, and I'm really worried today because there's been so much good news. I mean, good news as far as administration appointments goes. And now in Iraq, a good friend of mine who I got to know very well, Barham Salih, is the new president. And while it's a ceremonial position, I don't think you could ask for anyone better. So there will be a panel on Iraq?
I'm not sure, but let's go ahead and ask one of our panelists to address the question of how recent political shifts in Iraq affect our overall strategic position in the region in regard to Syria.
I'd like John to comment on it because John follows it more closely than I do. But I agree with Maury that given the fact that in the post-election environment in Iraq, everyone was speculating on how big a reverse it was for the U.S. because Prime Minister Abadi hadn't done very well and looked like Iranian influence was going to be determinative, et cetera. It came out about as well as you could possibly hope for with Barham Saleh as president, Adel Abdul Mahdi, whom John and I both know well, as prime minister. So this is actually a big reverse, I think, for Iran. That's not to say Iran is out of the picture or they don't have influence, including with those people. But this was about the best outcome the U.S. could have possibly hoped for.
John?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. My biggest concerns with both Barham and Adel is neither one of them has a real political base and constituency inside Iraq. They've got a big constituency in the West, I think, but they don't really have real juice in Iraq, which is going to make it all the more important that the United States really, as with a lot of these conflicts, stays in their ear, gives them support, signals to the Iranians that they have our support for the difficult things they're going to have to do. And I've got to say that with respect to Iraq, with respect, I don't know if you followed all the trouble that's happened in southern Iraq with regard to these protests and some anti-Iranian, some anti-U.S. Clearly, the Iranian militias are beginning to target U.S. facilities. I think we made a very problematic move in withdrawing our people from Basra under indirect fire from these Iranian militias. And I do think when those oil sanctions come into effect, I do worry that southern Iraq, if the Iranians really want to cause trouble for us under the radar in a relatively deniable way, they're not going to try and confront us directly closing the Straits of Hormuz. They're going to try and disrupt that 3 million barrels or so that Iraq is exporting to the market, which the Saudis would never be able to cover in terms of the barrels and the price of oil.
Sure. And just a word on Syria, from my perspective, when I look at Iraqi militias in Syria fighting on behalf of the Assad regime, it's really tough to determine who are the Iranian militias, who are the Iraqi militias, who are the Assad people, who are the Iranians wearing Assad uniforms, who are the Iraqis wearing Iranian uniforms, who are the Iranians wearing Iraqi uniforms, okay? So when I'm sort of looking at this analytically and our goal here is to push the Iranians out of Syria, well, does that include Iranian militias in Iraqi uniforms and in Syria uniforms? I think that's a problem that our policy has not yet tried to address. Next question. We'll go all the way over here.
Stuart Sloan, Vice Chairman of AJURI, that's the American Jewish International Relations Institute. My question is for General Amadrour. You mentioned the two goals of Israel with respect to Iran and Hezbollah, and I'm wondering whether or not Israel would like some material or other support from the United States in terms of equipment or anything else which would enhance their ability to accomplish those two missions.
It's very easy to answer. We are in a very deep dialogue with the administration. The truth is that this dialogue exists for many years, was very strong during the previous administration, and we continue it with this administration in those days, as we say in Hebrew, mamash. In those days, officials from Israel are here in Washington speaking with your side, and I'm sure that they will get with open arms, because the exchange of information and the dialogue itself brought very good relations between the two administrations. And there are some specific issues on the table, and I'm probably we will get positive answer. As I said, Israel is very clear about something which was very important for us for many, many years. Israel should be in a position to defend itself by itself. We were more than happy to see the Americans nearby helping because of their interest. But we are not urging the Americans to fight for us because of the Israeli interest. If you don't think that it is your interest, Israel will do the job for Israel by itself. We need your help in technology, in materials, money, umbrella in the international community, whatever. But the idea, the ideal philosophy of Israel security is based on the assumption that at the end of the day, Israel should be in a position to defend itself by itself, quoted by President Obama and President Trump many times. That is our policy. So if you ask about materials and technology and so on and so forth and intelligence, the answer is probably or not probably. The answer is yes. We want more. The more they will give us, easier for us to make the war. If you ask about actual interference of American forces, it is your decision. It is not our job to tell you what to do with the American military forces.
Excellent. Well, we are out of time, but in closing, I'd like to thank our panelists, and I don't think I could say it better than John Hannah said it. It'll still be bad, but it may not be totally awful. Let's give them a round of applause.